He was feared in Salford, respected on the streets, hunted by police, a gangster who walked with the calm of a man who knew no one would dare cross him. But before the headlines, the gunshots, and the name Mr. Big, Paul Massey was just another kid in the concrete sprawl of Little Hulton, learning early that on these streets, it's not who you are that matters, it's how far you'll go. This is the origin story of one of Britain's most notorious underworld figures. From street brawls to jail cells, from petty crime to kingmaker. Before we dive in, make sure to like the video, drop a comment on what you think of Massey's rise, and subscribe for more raw gangland stories that the mainstream won't touch. This is Born into the War Zone. In the 1970s, Salford wasn't just rough, it was war-torn. The post-industrial fallout had stripped entire neighborhoods of opportunity. Factories had closed, poverty set in like concrete. And where there's no hope, violence fills the void. Little Hulton, on the edge of Salford, became a proving ground. Young lads weren't planning for college, they were planning for survival. Every street had its own pecking order. Your name mattered. And if you didn't have one, you'd get crushed. Paul Massey came up in the middle of all that. One of 6 kids in a working-class household. His father was in and out of work, his mother kept the house together, but the streets kept calling. Massey found himself drawn to older lads, the ones with flashbikes, pit bulls, and scars that told stories. He learned quickly that fists did the talking. If you didn't stand your ground, you were nobody. And Paul Massey wasn't about to be nobody. By the time he was in his teens, Massey already had a rep. He wasn't the biggest, but he fought like he had something to prove, and people took notice. He didn't flinch, he didn't back down, and he never left a mate behind in a scrap. Back then, Salford was full of young crews, half gang, half family. Massey started running with a tight group of local lads. They weren't just hanging about, they were taking what they wanted. Shoplifting turned to break-ins, arguments turned to violence. The police were always circling, but Massey had a way of slipping through. He was smart. He learned how to handle pressure. He knew when to push and when to pause. He wasn't reckless like the others, he was methodical. Even then you could see it. He was thinking long game. By his early 20s, the name Paul Massey carried weight, not just because of what he did, but because of how he carried himself. Calm, measured, and dangerous when he had to be. In 1999, things escalated. A nightclub row turned violent. Massey stabbed a man in the groin, a move designed to cripple, not kill. It was surgical, brutal, and it landed him with a 14-year sentence. For most, prison is punishment. For Massey, it was preparation. He didn't crumble inside, he grew. Spent his time lifting weights, reading books, networking. He built contacts, Manchester lads, Liverpool boys, even connections from London. His reach expanded while he was behind bars. But more than that, he watched, studied. He learned how the system worked, how prison politics mirrored street politics. He saw how respect moved through walls. And when he walked free, he wasn't just known, he was recognized. The name Paul Massey had become something more. It carried an aura, not just of fear, but of influence. Salford in the early 2000s was a battleground. New players had emerged, the drug trade had grown teeth. Younger gangs were more erratic, more armed, more desperate, but none of them had what Massey had. Decades of experience and a network built on loyalty. He re-entered the scene like a general returning to his regiment, launched security companies, took control of door work at major clubs, offered conflict resolution services to rival gangs. If there was a problem in Salford, Massey could solve it, for a price. But he didn't move like a street thug. He wore suits, spoke in measured tones, went to council meetings. Some saw him as a community leader. Others whispered about the power he held in the shadows. He knew everyone, from politicians to hitmen. He could negotiate a truce, or light the match. And while some called him Paul, others started calling him something else. Mr. Big. When Paul Massey stepped back onto Salford streets after prison, he didn't return as a man looking for peace. He returned as a man who'd learned how to rule. This wasn't about petty crime anymore. This was about control. Over turf, over money, over people. And in a city drowning in chaos, Paul Massey offered structure. But it came at a price. By the early 2000s, Massey was more than just a street name. He was a presence, a businessman with one foot in legitimate enterprise and the other buried deep in the criminal underworld. He set up security firms, door supervision contracts for clubs, pubs, and events. On paper, it was all above board. But beneath the surface, it was a protection racket in a tailored suit. If you ran a business in Salford, you either paid Massey's people or you had problems. Violence was rare, but implied. He didn't need to make threats. His name did the talking. Everyone knew what he was capable of. Clubs stayed in line, rivals backed off. The police knew he was moving in the shadows, but they couldn't pin anything on him. He played the system like a chessboard, and he always seemed 3 moves ahead. Massey's influence wasn't limited to business. He became something else in Salford, something harder to define. A fixer, a mediator, a man who settled scores before they turned into shootings. When 2 gangs clashed, Massey got the call. He'd step in, call a meeting, broker a deal. He understood the rules of the street better than anyone. And young gang members, even those who barely knew him, listened. Because everyone knew disrespecting Massey meant consequences. But was he keeping the peace or controlling the war? Some saw him as a necessary evil, keeping a volatile city from tearing itself apart. Others said he was orchestrating it all behind the scenes, playing factions off each other to stay on top. Maybe it was both. Maybe that was the genius. As his power grew, so did his list of enemies. By the mid-2000s, younger, hungrier gangs were rising. Some saw Massey as an untouchable relic. Others saw him as a target. One group in particular, the A-Team, a Salford gang born from younger, more aggressive roots, began to rise through the ranks. Their leaders didn't have Massey's finesse, but they had firepower, manpower, and ambition. The city's balance began to shift. Shootings increased. Attacks became more brazen. And though Massey kept calm on the surface, insiders say he knew the old codes were crumbling. Respect was no longer enough. Fear was making a comeback. Massey was no longer just a local name, he was a national figure. Journalists started sniffing around. His name appeared in reports about gangland mediation. Rumours swirled about his links to Manchester's drug trade. The police put him under intense surveillance, bugged cars, raided businesses, monitored phones. But they couldn't make anything stick. Massey had learned from his time inside. He kept his circle tight and his conversations tighter. He once told a reporter, "I'm just a businessman. I help people. I don't cause trouble. I solve it." It was a good line, a rehearsed one. But behind the calm exterior, Massey was steering a ship through stormy waters. He had money, he had power, he had enemies. And Salford was a ticking clock. Paul Massey wasn't just a gangster anymore, he was a name. Whispered on street corners, feared in back alleys, and now written on election ballots. In 2012, the man known as Mr. Big made his most unexpected move. He ran for mayor. The criminal underworld watched in disbelief. The media leaned in, and Salford held its breath. Massey's decision to run for mayor wasn't a gimmick. It was calculated. He launched his campaign on a message of anti-corruption and community justice. He spoke about neglected youth, failing services, and the need for someone who actually understood the streets. Posters went up, interviews were given, and Massey appeared, clean-cut, sharp suit, speaking not as a gangster, but as a man with vision. To some, it was laughable. To others, it made total sense. Who better to bring order than the man who'd ruled the city's underbelly for decades? But behind the campaign trail, another world continued to turn. His rivals were still watching. The police were still listening, and his reputation still lingered like smoke around every word he said. The press pounced. Tabloids dubbed him Salford's godfather. Headlines screamed about his criminal record, his stabbing conviction, his supposed ties to organized crime. But Massey didn't flinch. He leaned into the heat. In interviews, he played the misunderstood anti-hero, a reformed man, a local boy trying to fix a broken city. He denied wrongdoing. Said his past was just that, past. Claimed he'd only ever been about protecting his community. For every person who saw a gangster trying to rebrand himself, there was another who saw a streetwise voice speaking truth to power. He didn't win. He barely cracked the vote. But he left a mark. Massey's political run gave him something more valuable than votes. It gave him legitimacy. No longer just a name whispered in fear, he was now openly acknowledged in civic life. He appeared at council meetings, gave statements to the press. Local figures, once silent, now had to answer questions about him. It gave him a shield. Police couldn't treat him like a shadowy figure anymore. He was in the public eye. And that blurred the line even further between businessman, community figure, and criminal mastermind. But not everyone was buying it. Rival gangs, especially the rising A-Team faction, saw the move as arrogance, flashing the crown in front of enemies hungry for a kingdom. Tensions escalated. While Massey shook hands and spoke on platforms, bullets were flying in the background. Salford was changing. Gun crime was rising. Younger, more volatile crews were enforcing their presence with AKs and petrol bombs. The A-Team, now gaining ground, viewed Massey's influence as an obstacle. They wanted dominance, and Massey stood in the way. What was once backroom tension began to spill onto the streets. Drive-by shootings, armed raids, anonymous threats. Massey never showed fear. He walked the streets like he owned them. But insiders say he knew what was coming. The streets weren't playing by his rules anymore, and in gangland, when you lose control of the rules, you become a target. On July 26, 2015, just after 7:30 in the evening, Paul Massey stepped out of his silver BMW outside his home in Clifton, Salford. He didn't know someone was waiting. A masked gunman in military fatigues emerged from the shadows, armed with a submachine gun. He opened fire. Massey tried to run, dodging between trees and into his front garden. But there was no escape. 5 bullets found their mark. Paul Massey, Mr. Big, bled out in front of his own doorstep. The King of Salford was dead. The hit wasn't chaotic, it wasn't desperate, it was surgical. The killer moved with purpose. Dressed in army gear, carrying an Uzi-style weapon, he sprayed over a dozen rounds before disappearing without a trace. Neighbors heard the shots. Kids were playing just streets away. It was broad daylight, a hit designed to send a message. This wasn't street-level beef. This was organized, military, intentional. Police flooded the scene. Forensics combed the area. A city that had lived under quiet tension for years had finally reached detonation. The legend had been erased. But who ordered it? And why now? Salford held its breath. Massey wasn't just a gangster. He was a known figure. Feared, yes, but also respected. He kept things from boiling over. And now he was gone. People started locking doors earlier. Shop owners stayed quiet. Rival gangs began circling, testing boundaries. The streets were tense with anticipation. The police launched Operation Leopard, an intense investigation into the murder, the gangs, and the emerging power struggle beneath it all. Behind closed doors, the whispers pointed in one direction: the A-Team. It would take nearly 3 years before a name surfaced publicly. Mark Fellows, nicknamed the Iceman. A hitman with ties to the A-Team, calm, calculated, emotionally dead behind the eyes. A man who could kill and disappear, leaving barely a trace. When he was finally arrested, the evidence was chilling. A GPS running watch showed him scouting Massey's street days before the hit. Cell tower data placed him at the scene. He had trained for the job like a soldier. In court, he showed no remorse, no emotion, just cold silence. He was found guilty of the murder of Paul Massey, and later the murder of John Kinsella, another underworld figure with links to Massey. Fellows was sentenced to life with a whole life order. No parole, no second chance. The Iceman was locked away. You'd think the death of a king would bring closure. But in Salford, it opened the gates to a new kind of warfare. Younger gangs, unchecked and unstructured, rushed to fill the vacuum. Retaliations followed. Firebombings, stabbings, drive-by shootings. Salford spiraled. The codes that Massey enforced were gone. Fear remained, but order didn't. The city became more dangerous, not less. And for many, it proved the one thing they never wanted to admit. Paul Massey may have been a criminal, but he was also the last man holding the chaos back. The gunfire that ended Paul Massey's life didn't silence the streets. It awakened something far worse. With Mr. Big gone, there was no clear successor. No hierarchy, just fear and ambition. In the vacuum he left behind, Salford descended into a new chapter of violence, one more chaotic than anything it had seen before. In the weeks following Massey's assassination, Salford changed. The old guard was gone. What remained were factions, smaller, younger, less disciplined. The A-Team expanded its influence, but the anti-A-Team, backed by Massey loyalists and rival crews, pushed back. Shootings became routine, pipe bombs were left on doorsteps, masked gunmen prowled estates by night. Families were caught in the crossfire, the streets didn't grieve, they burned. Massey's death hadn't ended the war, it intensified it. What he once held together through fear and respect was now ripped apart by blood and revenge. Mark Fellows, the man who murdered Paul Massey, became the face of this new era. In 2019, he was convicted not only for Massey's execution, but for the murder of Massey's associate, John Kinsella. Both hits were methodical, both were precise. Fellows wasn't a street thug, he was a professional killer. His GPS data, cycling routes, encrypted phones, they painted a picture of a man who trained like an athlete, but killed like a soldier. He was sentenced to a whole life term. The Iceman wouldn't walk free again. But his legacy, that still lived in the paranoia and the silence that spread across Salford. In death, Paul Massey became myth. The media painted him as a gangland godfather. Some remembered him as a community man who brought order when no one else would. Others as a dangerous manipulator who thrived off fear. There were no statues, no murals. But his name never left the city. He became shorthand for a different kind of gangster. Old school, disciplined, brutal, but principled. A throwback to a time when there were still rules on the streets. And even among the new generation, his name still meant something. Nearly a decade on, Salford still feels the impact. The gangs are younger, the weapons more extreme, the loyalty more fragile. There's no more king. Just a revolving door of power, violence and betrayal. The city has changed, but it hasn't healed. Some say Massey kept the wolves at bay. Others say he bred them. Maybe both are true, because his empire wasn't made of bricks. It was built on fear, silence, and control. And when it fell, it didn't collapse. It detonated.